Surgical precision requires years of training. Yet someone in Depression-era Cleveland possessed this rare skill and deployed it with methodical brutality. Between 1935 and 1938, the dismembered remains of at least 12 individuals emerged from the grimy industrial shadows of Kingsbury Run. Meticulously severed torsos, heads separated with expert precision. A killer who understood human anatomy in ways few outside medical circles could. And one question haunts this case more than any other. Did America's most infamous unsolved serial killer wear a physician's white coat by day? The answer lies buried in the rubble of time, scattered like the victims themselves across Cleveland's forgotten history. September 1935. A teenage boy wandering near Jackass Hill stumbles upon what appears to be a department store mannequin. The discovery quickly reveals itself as something far more sinister. The lower half of a human torso, expertly severed at the lumbar region. The flesh, washed clean. The cuts methodical. Hours later, investigators locate the corresponding upper half nearby. This was no ordinary murder. No crime of passion. The body had been drained of blood entirely. The dismemberment performed with surgical skill that shocked even veteran detectives. The victim was eventually identified as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old hospital orderly known for frequenting the seedy underbelly of Cleveland. The killer left no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no traces of themselves, only their handiwork. 2 weeks later, the pattern repeats. Another torso, another victim meticulously dismembered. Florence Polillo, a 41-year-old barmaid with connections to Cleveland's underground. Again, the cutting technique suggests medical knowledge, not the frenzied hacking of an amateur, but controlled, deliberate dissection. Cleveland in the 1930s was a city deeply scarred by the Great Depression. Kingsbury Run, a maze of railroad tracks cutting through the city's eastern flank, housed hundreds of desperate, transient workers in makeshift shantytowns. The perfect hunting ground, the perfect victims, people who might not be missed. By January 1936, fear permeates every corner of the city. 2 more torsos appear. The newspapers coin a name, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. But there was nothing mad about these killings. Nothing frenzied or impulsive. Each victim represents calculation, precision, knowledge. Enter Eliot Ness, fresh from his triumph against Al Capone in Chicago, now Cleveland's safety director, a man accustomed to bringing order from chaos. Ness assembles his best detectives and forensic specialists. He personally examines crime scenes, studies photographs, interrogates witnesses. For the first time in his storied career, he faces an adversary who leaves no trail, a ghost in a city of shadows. The investigation zeroes in on the method of dismemberment. Coroners note the exceptional skill required. The bodies were not merely cut apart. They were anatomically disarticulated, limbs removed at joint connections, decapitations performed with knowledge of neck anatomy. These weren't crude hacksaw jobs, but the work of someone who understood the human body intimately. June 1936. A severed head appears on a hillside near the run. Male, approximately 40 years old. The eyes stare vacantly at the Cleveland skyline. The coroner's report highlights a critical detail: chemical preservation. The head had been kept in some form of preservative fluid before disposal, suggesting the killer had access to medical supplies and private facilities to conduct their grisly work unobserved. The pattern continues with merciless regularity. Parts of victims appearing across the city, always dismembered, always expertly cleaned, always betraying the knowledge of someone trained in human anatomy. Each new discovery reinforces the central question: which of Cleveland's medical professionals harbors this murderous secret? Ness and his team compile a list of every physician, surgeon, medical student, and butcher in the Cleveland area. They investigate hospital staff, medical school facilities, and private practices. Hundreds of interviews, thousands of man-hours. The trail remains cold. Then comes the break they've been waiting for. A witness reports seeing an unusual figure near the Kingsbury Run area. Tall, well-dressed, carrying a medical bag. The figure doesn't match the appearance of the local doctors or the transients who populate the area. The witness's description leads investigators to a property on the outskirts of Cleveland. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, first cousin to a congressman, graduate of Cleveland Medical School, military service as a field surgeon during the Great War, current employment at a local hospital. The perfect credentials for the perfect suspect. Ness brings Sweeney in for questioning. For 2 weeks, interrogators probe the doctor's knowledge, movements, and potential connections to victims. Sweeney's responses are measured, but occasionally contradictory. His knowledge of anatomy is exceptional, even for a physician. More telling, he demonstrates unusual familiarity with the case details never published in the newspapers. The investigators administer a primitive form of lie detector test. Sweeney's results are troubling, but inconclusive. There is evidence, circumstantial, but compelling, yet not enough for an arrest. No physical connection to the crimes can be established. Then, as abruptly as they began, the killings stop. Sweeney voluntarily commits himself to a mental institution, where he will remain for years. From the institution, taunting postcards begin arriving at Ness's office. Cryptic messages, veiled references to the murders, written in a style that matches Sweeney's writing patterns. Ness becomes convinced. The evidence points towards Sweeney, his medical knowledge, his instability, his apparent obsession with the case. But without physical evidence, without a confession, the case remains officially unsolved. Did Eliot Ness, the man who brought down Capone, identify Cleveland's phantom killer but fail to gather enough evidence for prosecution? Or was Sweeney merely another dead end in a case defined by its lack of clarity? What we know with certainty is this. The killer possessed medical knowledge that set them apart. They operated with a surgeon's precision in the disposal of human remains. They understood anatomy well enough to disarticulate bodies at their natural separation points. And they managed to avoid leaving even a single fingerprint, a single strand of hair, a single piece of traceable evidence. Somewhere in Cleveland's medical community, during those dark Depression years, a healer became a killer. A physician betrayed their oath. Someone who knew how to save lives chose instead to take them, with calculated, professional efficiency. The persistent question of medical training haunted every aspect of the investigation. Not just the anatomical knowledge, but access to the tools, the chemicals, the private spaces needed for such methodical work. In a city with hundreds of medical professionals, narrowing the field of suspects proved nearly impossible. July 1936 brought another grim discovery. A female torso found floating in Lake Erie, her skin weathered by water, but her dissection bearing the same signature precision. 4 days later, a canvas bag washes ashore containing thighs and lower legs, perfectly matching the torso. Cleveland police drain parts of the lake, searching for additional remains. They recover only fragments, a rib, a foot, partial vertebrae. Detective Peter Marilow, a veteran investigator who would ultimately dedicate 4 years to the case, developed a theory. The lake disposal differed from the Kingsbury Run pattern. Either the killer was evolving their disposal methods, or perhaps, more disturbing still, Cleveland harbored multiple killers with medical training. Marilow went undercover, disguising himself as a transient. For weeks he lived among the shanty dwellers of Kingsbury Run, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone watching too closely, someone who didn't belong. His reports detailed the desperate conditions of those living in the shadow of Cleveland's industry, the very people being targeted. These victims aren't random, Marilow wrote in his case notes. They're selected precisely because they exist on the periphery, people without permanent addresses, without concerned families to report them missing. In a perverse way, this demonstrates the killer's intelligence, not just in method, but in victim selection. September 1936. The seventh and eighth victims appear within days of each other. Both male, both bearing the familiar marks of expert dismemberment. The coroner's examination reveals something new: evidence of chemical preservatives in the tissues. This suggests the killer is keeping the bodies for periods before disposal, perhaps studying them, perhaps experimenting. The investigation began examining a new line of inquiry: medical research facilities where preservatives were commonly used, anatomical laboratories, teaching hospitals, private medical collections, places where a killer with medical knowledge could potentially store human remains without arousing suspicion. By early 1937, the pattern shifts again. A ninth victim appears, this time with distinctive characteristics: a tattooed forearm with the initials WC. Finally, investigators have a clear identifier that might lead to a name, a history, a connection. Police departments across the Midwest circulate descriptions of the tattoo. Months pass before an identification emerges: Wallace Collins, a 32-year-old drifter last seen in a Cleveland soup kitchen. Interviews with those who knew Collins reveal nothing unusual about his final days. No strange encounters, no mentioned fears. Just another struggling soul in a city full of them. His path to becoming the killer's ninth victim remains as opaque as the killer's identity. Then, the most disturbing development yet. The 10th victim, a woman, shows something previous victims hadn't: signs of surgical experimentation. The coroner's report notes unusual incisions that served no apparent purpose in dismemberment. Small, precise cuts exploring the abdominal cavity. Had the killer's motivations evolved from murder to something even more sinister: unauthorized medical experimentation? This revelation forces investigators to consider a radical theory. What if these weren't purely murders of opportunity or pathological impulse? What if they served some twisted research purpose? The Depression era had seen numerous medical ethics violations in the name of advancing knowledge. Could these killings represent an extreme perversion of medical curiosity? Cleveland's medical community recoiled at the suggestion. Hospital boards and medical school administrators provided alibis for staff, defended their colleagues, insisted no one in their professional circles could be responsible. Yet the evidence of medical knowledge remained impossible to dismiss. Detective Merillo began assembling a psychological profile of the killer, one of the first attempts at such analysis in American criminal investigation. His notes describe someone of above-average intelligence, likely male, age 30 to 45, with significant anatomical training. Someone who could move between worlds, respectable enough to avoid suspicion, yet familiar enough with Cleveland's underbelly to hunt there unnoticed. By mid-1938, as victim counts reached 12, Eliot Ness made a controversial decision. Without sufficient evidence to arrest any suspect, he ordered a massive raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown. Hundreds of transients were rousted from makeshift homes, their shelters burned to the ground under official orders. Ness claimed this was for sanitary purposes, but many suspected the truth. He was attempting to eliminate the killer's hunting grounds. The Cleveland press condemned the action. Punishing the potential victims rather than catching the predator represents a fundamental failure of justice. Ness, typically adept at public relations, found himself on the defensive. For the first time in his career, his reputation suffered. Whether by coincidence or direct result of Ness's actions, the killings in Cleveland stopped. No more torsos appeared along the railway tracks. No more heads recovered from abandoned factories. No more precisely severed limbs washing on a Lake Erie's shores. But the question remained unanswered. Did the killers stop because their hunting grounds were destroyed? Did they simply move to another city? Or did they continue operating with even greater caution? their victims now entirely undetectable. The official investigation gradually subsided into cold case status. Ness would never publicly identify Dr. Sweeney as his prime suspect, though his private notes made his suspicions clear. Without physical evidence linking Sweeney to any crime scene, prosecution remained impossible. The torso murder would become Ness's greatest unsolved case, a shadow that followed him for the remainder of his career. Dr. Sweeney remained institutionalized until his death in 1965. He never confessed, never provided closure. The mysterious postcards to Ness continued for years, each one analyzed by handwriting experts, each one suggesting knowledge only the killer might possess, yet none providing definitive proof. The investigation's focus on medical expertise created a troubling reality. The killer likely moved freely through respectable Cleveland society while committing these atrocities. Perhaps someone who treated patients by day and hunted the vulnerable by night. This duality represented the most disturbing aspect of the case. September 1938. Another discovery threatened to reignite public panic. A female torso found near a lumberyard within Cleveland city limits. Detective Marilow immediately recognized the familiar dismemberment technique. However, further examination revealed subtle differences. The cutting wasn't quite as precise. The body hadn't been drained of blood with the same thoroughness. Was this a copycat? Or had the original killer's skills deteriorated? Coroner Samuel Gerber, who had examined most of the previous victims, declared it unrelated to the torso murder series. Not everyone was convinced. Some investigators believed the killer might be deliberately altering their methodology to confuse authorities. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. What became increasingly clear was the killer's intimate knowledge of police procedure. Crime scenes contained no fingerprints despite surfaces that should have retained them, no footprints despite muddy conditions, no witnesses despite busy areas. This suggested someone who understood forensic investigation, perhaps even someone with connections to law enforcement itself. This possibility led to an unprecedented security measure. Ness restricted case information even within his own department. Only a select group of detectives received complete briefings. This unusual step bred resentment, but Ness remained adamant. If the killer had inside knowledge of the investigation, limiting information flow was essential. Cleveland's Regional Medical Society formed an anonymous committee of surgeons to review the coroner's findings without knowing their source. Their conclusion proved telling. The dismemberment exhibits knowledge consistent with surgical training, though not necessarily at specialist level. The work shows confidence with anatomy, but lacks the refined preservation of structures seen in professional surgical technique. This assessment narrowed the field somewhat. They were looking for someone with medical training, but not necessarily a practicing surgeon. A general practitioner, perhaps, a medical researcher, a former military field surgeon, or a medical school dropout who had completed enough training to understand anatomical principles. Detective Marilow's undercover work continued. He infiltrated medical study groups, attended public lectures at the medical college, observed hospital staffs coming and going during shift changes. His notes from this period reveal growing frustration. The killer could be any of hundreds of men in white coats walking these halls daily. Without physical evidence connecting suspect to crime, we pursue shadows. Meanwhile, the psychological profile developed further. Investigators consulted with early practitioners of criminal psychology, including doctors who had studied similar cases abroad. The emerging profile describes someone deeply compartmentalized, able to maintain normal relationships and professional standards while harboring extreme pathology. Most telling was the consistency of method across all victims. Unlike many serial killers who evolve their techniques through experimentation, the Cleveland torso murder demonstrated the same precise approach from the first victim to the last. This suggested someone who had refined their skills before the murders began, perhaps through legitimate medical practice or education. By early 1939, with no new confirmed victims appearing for months, the investigation shifted to historical cases. Detective teams reviewed unsolved murders throughout Ohio and neighboring states, looking for similar dismemberment characteristics. This retrospective search yielded disturbing results. 6 possible connected cases dating back to 1921, spanning multiple jurisdictions. A 1923 case from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, particularly stood out. The dismembered victim showed the same precise cutting technique. The body had been similarly drained of blood. Most telling, chemical preservation had been applied to certain body parts. If connected, this would expand the killer's timeline significantly, suggesting a murderous career spanning at least 15 years. Investigators plotted these potential connected cases geographically. A pattern emerged: a rough corridor following major rail lines between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, with cases clustering around medical centers in both cities. Could the killer be someone who traveled regularly between these locations? A visiting lecturer, perhaps? A medical supplier? A doctor with practices or hospital privileges in multiple cities? The geographical analysis brought investigators back to Dr. Sweeney. Records confirmed he had worked in several hospitals along this corridor during the time frame in question. His military medical service provided skills consistent with the dismemberment technique. His psychiatric instability offered potential motive, though the precise nature of that motive remained elusive. What prevented Sweeney's arrest was the complete absence of physical evidence. No murder scenes had ever been discovered, only disposal sites. Without a location where the dismemberment occurred, investigators could not establish physical connections between any suspect and the crimes. The question of where these dismemberments took place became central to the investigation. The body showed evidence of being washed clean, suggesting access to appropriate facilities. The precise cutting would require proper lighting and tools. The complete blood drainage indicated a space that could be thoroughly cleaned afterward. Investigators surveyed every potential location in Cleveland that met these criteria: hospital operating rooms, medical school dissection laboratories, meat processing facilities, mortuaries. Each was examined for evidence, each staff member interviewed. Nothing conclusive emerged. In late 1939, Detective Marilow proposed a radical theory that the killer might be using mobile facilities rather than a fixed location, perhaps a specially equipped vehicle, allowing for both abduction and subsequent dismemberment without requiring transport of victims to a secondary location. This would explain the absence of witnesses reporting suspicious movement of bodies. Police began documenting every physician who owned larger vehicles, delivery vans, trucks, specially modified automobiles. This line of inquiry produced hundreds of potential leads, each requiring investigation, each ultimately leading nowhere conclusive. By 1940, the dedicated torso murder investigation unit was gradually disbanded. Resources were reallocated to other cases. The United States' impending entry into World War II shifted priorities. Detective Marilow continued investigating independently, long after official channels had moved on. His dedication to the case bordered on obsession. He would continue pursuing leads until his retirement decades later. Eliot Ness never publicly discussed his suspicions regarding Dr. Sweeney. The combination of Sweeney's political connections and lack of physical evidence made formal accusations impossible. Some historians suggest Ness privately considered the case solved but unprovable, a conclusion that provided no justice for the victims nor closure for a terrorized city. The most unsettling aspect of the case remains the killer's medical knowledge. Not just the technical skill displayed, but the psychological implications. Someone took the years of training meant to heal and deliberately perverted that knowledge to commit perfect murders. Someone who had likely taken the Hippocratic Oath to first do no harm became one of America's most methodical killers. If Dr. Sweeney was indeed the Cleveland torso murderer, his institutionalization effectively ended the killing spree. If he wasn't, if another medical professional was responsible, then they either stopped killing or became even more careful about hiding their victims. Either possibility offers little comfort and no resolution. The ripples of the Cleveland torso murders extended far beyond the immediate investigation. The case fundamentally transformed American policing, forensic science, and the public's understanding of serial murder, all through its stubborn resistance to conventional detective work. While World War II consumed America's attention, Detective Merylo continued his solitary pursuit. His investigation notebooks from this period reveal an evolution in thinking, no longer focused solely on identifying the killer, but understanding the psychology behind the crimes. "These are not murders of passion or financial gain," he wrote. "These are acts of twisted purpose. The methodical nature, the retention of body parts, the consistent technique, all point to a perpetrator who derives specific satisfaction from the process itself." This psychological approach represented a profound shift in American criminal investigation. Before the Cleveland cases, murders were primarily understood through motive, jealousy, greed, revenge. The torso murders forced a new paradigm. Murder as an expression of psychological compulsion, as methodical ritual, as perverted expertise. The killer's apparent medical knowledge presented a particularly troubling dimension. Dr. Anton Lacey, a forensic psychiatrist consulted during the later investigation, provided one of the first attempts at profiling this type of murderer. "We are dealing with someone who has compartmentalized their psyche to an extraordinary degree. They can function professionally, perhaps even excel, while harboring extreme pathological drives." The medical precision displayed suggests not merely knowledge, but pride in technical execution. By 1944, new technologies emerged that investigators wished they'd had during the active investigation. Improved fingerprinting techniques might have detected traces on victims' remains. Enhanced chemical analysis could have identified specific preservatives used. These advances came years too late for the torso victims, but would transform how subsequent serial murder investigations were conducted. The investigation's files, particularly the detailed medical analyses, became teaching materials at the FBI's nascent behavioral science unit decades later. The Cleveland torso murderer, a killer who was never caught, ironically helped develop the methodologies that would later identify similar criminals. In 1947, the discovery of the Black Dahlia murder in Los Angeles sparked immediate comparisons to the Cleveland cases. The victim, Elizabeth Short, had been bisected at the waist with surgical precision. When Cleveland detectives shared their case files with Los Angeles investigators, the similarities proved striking, though no definitive connection was ever established. This potential connection raised a disturbing possibility. Had the Cleveland killer simply relocated? Had they continued their grisly work in other jurisdictions? The question prompted one of the first multi-state efforts to identify pattern killings across America, a precursor to the FBI's violent criminal apprehension program decades later. The Cleveland Plain Dealer revisited the case in a 1953 retrospective series. Their investigation uncovered previously unreported potential victims and explored connections to unsolved murders across the Midwest. Eliot Ness, by then working in the private sector, declined all interview requests. His continued silence regarding Dr. Sweeney, neither confirming nor denying his suspicions, only deepened public fascination with the case. Former coroner Samuel Gerber proved more forthcoming. In a lengthy interview, he revealed additional details about the dismemberment techniques. The killer displayed what I would call anatomical curiosity. Some incisions weren't necessary for dismemberment, but appeared to be exploratory, as if the perpetrator was conducting some form of personal research. This suggests not merely medical knowledge, but ongoing medical interest. This observation opened another disturbing possibility, that the murders served some perceived scientific purpose in the killer's mind. This concept of murder as perverse research would later be recognized as a pattern in certain medical professionals who became killers, from Nazi doctors to nurse serial killers in modern hospitals. Dr. Sweeney remained institutionalized, writing occasional cryptic letters to former colleagues. His medical license had been revoked due to his mental condition rather than any criminal conviction. His psychiatric files remained sealed, though rumors persistently circulated about confessions made during treatment sessions. Without corroboration, these remained speculative. In 1962, Detective Merillo, long retired, published his memoirs. The chapter on the torso murders revealed his personal conclusion. "I believe we identified the killer, but could never prove it legally." The most brilliant aspect of these crimes wasn't the medical skill displayed in the dismemberment, but the complete absence of physical evidence connecting victims to murder sites. The killer understood not just anatomy, but forensic limitations. When Dr. Sweeney died in 1965, several investigators expected a deathbed confession. None came. His personal effects contained no journals, no trophies, no evidence connecting him to the murders. If he was indeed the Cleveland torso murderer, he carried that secret to his grave. Throughout the 1970s, as FBI profiling techniques developed and the term serial killer entered the public lexicon, the Cleveland cases were repeatedly referenced as archetypal examples of organized, methodical pattern killing. The contrast between the killer's methodical precision and the chaotic lives of their victims became a standard teaching point in criminology programs nationwide. In 1997, the Cleveland Police Department officially reopened the case using modern forensic techniques. The few preserved tissue samples from victims were subjected to DNA analysis. Partial fingerprints from preserved body parts were run through automated identification systems developed decades after the crimes. Chemical residues were analyzed using technologies unimaginable in the 1930s. These modern forensic efforts yielded fascinating insights, but no definitive answers. The preservative chemicals identified on some victims had indeed been available in medical settings during the 1930s. Trace evidence suggested at least some dismemberments occurred in a tiled environment with drainage, consistent with medical or mortuary facilities. Yet nothing conclusively identified a specific perpetrator. The most significant development came in 2001, when crime historian James Badal gained access to previously sealed records from Ness's personal files. These included transcripts of Dr. Sweeney's interrogation and detailed notes from the psychiatric evaluation conducted during his initial institutionalization. While not conclusive, the records revealed Sweeney's disturbing familiarity with case details unpublished at the time, details only investigators or the killer would know. Perhaps most chilling were the postcards sent to Eliot Ness throughout the 1940s and early 1950s. Modern handwriting analysis confirmed what investigators had long suspected. They almost certainly came from Dr. Sweeney. Their contents, filled with oblique references to anatomy and dismemberment, stopped just short of explicit confession. In 2010, anthropologists conducted facial reconstructions of the unidentified victims using preserved remains and contemporary photographs. These images, representing people who had lived on society's margins, been murdered with surgical precision, and remained nameless for decades, provided a powerful reminder of the human cost behind the clinical case files. 6 of the 13 confirmed victims remain unidentified even today, existing only as case numbers and anatomical descriptions in dusty police archives. Their anonymity in death mirrors their invisibility in life. People society overlooked, making them perfect targets for a killer who understood that the absence of connection makes murder easier to conceal. The medical precision that defines these murders continues to haunt investigators. That someone with the training to heal could so methodically destroy lives represents a fundamental betrayal of not just professional ethics, but human connection itself. The killer transformed medical knowledge, meant to understand and preserve life, into its darkest opposite. The question that has persisted for nearly 9 decades remains deceptively simple, yet profoundly complex. Did a physician commit these murders? The evidence suggests medical knowledge, but could someone have acquired such skills through other means? Anatomy textbooks, butchery experience, or military field training? This central uncertainty has kept the case from fading into historical obscurity. Modern criminal psychologists reviewing the case files have developed more nuanced theories about the killer's possible motivations. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, forensic psychologist specializing in serial murder, suggests the Cleveland torso murder displays characteristics of what we now call an organized killer: methodical, controlled, deliberate. But there's something else present in these crimes, an almost clinical detachment. The dismemberment wasn't merely practical for disposal, it was executed with professional pride. This observation aligns with what contemporary investigators call signature versus MO, modus operandi. The killer's MO, the practical aspects of how they committed their crimes, involve selecting vulnerable victims and dismembering them to prevent identification. But their signature, the psychologically motivated aspects that went beyond what was necessary, was the surgical precision itself. This distinction suggests not just someone with medical knowledge, but someone who took satisfaction in displaying that knowledge. Amateur historians and true crime enthusiasts have kept the case alive in public consciousness, sometimes pursuing leads overlooked by original investigators. In 2017, retired detective Robert Meticulously followed one such lead, tracing the professional activities of several Cleveland medical practitioners during the murder timeline. His research revealed that 3 doctors from the original suspect pool had unexplained absences that aligned precisely with the murder dates. It's circumstantial, of course, Meticulously noted in his self-published investigation, but the statistical probability of these absences randomly aligning with the established murder dates is extraordinarily low. This finding reignited interest in the possibility that the killer might not have been Dr. Sweeney after all, but another medical professional entirely, perhaps one never seriously considered by Ness and his team. In 2019, forensic anthropologists from Case Western Reserve University conducted a comprehensive review of all available autopsy records and photographs. Their analysis offered a profound new insight. The dismemberment techniques evolved subtly over time, showing increasing refinement. Early victims showed evidence of some hesitation marks and less precise cutting, while later victims demonstrated more confident technique. This progression suggests 2 possibilities. Either the killer was perfecting their method through practice, or they were continuing to develop their medical knowledge concurrent with the murders. If the latter, this might indicate someone in medical training rather than an established professional, perhaps a student or resident who was actively learning anatomy while committing the crimes. The geographical analysis of victim discovery locations has also yielded new perspectives. When mapped with modern analytical tools, a clear pattern emerges. All victims were found within reasonable proximity to medical facilities existing in 1930s Cleveland. More specifically, they clustered around locations where medical waste might have been disposed of during that era. This suggests the killer might have been familiar with medical waste disposal routes and timetables, knowledge that would be common among hospital staff, waste management personnel, or public health officials, but not necessarily physicians themselves. This broadens the suspect pool beyond doctors to include various medical support personnel who would have anatomical knowledge through workplace exposure rather than formal training. Cleveland journalist Angela Townsend, who has studied the case for over 20 years, proposed an alternative theory in her 2020 book, Shadows of Kingsbury Run, that the killer might have been a woman. The historical investigation automatically assumed a male perpetrator. Townsend writes, despite the fact that the 1930s Cleveland medical community included numerous women with anatomical training, nurses, midwives, laboratory technicians, and a small but significant number of female physicians. Her research identified 17 women with medical training who had both access to the necessary facilities and connections to areas where victims were discovered. None had been seriously investigated during the original case. While controversial, her theory highlights how gendered assumptions might have blinded investigators to potential suspects. The most haunting aspect of the Cleveland torso murders remains not just their brutality, but their strange position in criminal history. A case where the method clearly points to the killer's identity, yet simultaneously makes that identity impossible to conclusively determine. The very precision that suggests medical training also prevented the collection of evidence that might have identified which medical professional was responsible. Eliot Ness's career never fully recovered from this unsolved case. Though he would go on to other positions and accomplishments, the shadow of these murders followed him. In private correspondence discovered after his death, he wrote to a former colleague, "Some failures haunt you precisely because you know the answer but cannot prove it. Knowledge without justice is its own special torment." If Dr. Sweeney was indeed the Cleveland torso murderer, as many investigators believed, then the case represents a peculiar form of partial justice. His institutionalization, while not for murder, nevertheless removed him from society. The killing stopped. Yet, without confirmation, without admission, the case remains perpetually open, neither solved nor completely cold. For the victims, both those identified and those who remain nameless, this ambiguity represents a final indignity. Their lives ended at the hands of someone who viewed human bodies as objects for dismemberment. Their deaths remain statistically unsolved despite decades of investigation. Their stories persist primarily as evidence in criminology textbooks, rather than as memorials to lives cut short. Perhaps the most appropriate lens through which to view this case comes from Detective Marilow's final notes before his retirement. The torso murder case taught me that some questions remain unanswered not because we lack intelligence or dedication, but because the truth itself is fragmented, like the victims, scattered across time and place, never to be fully reassembled. Yet we continue searching, because the pursuit of those fragments is what justice demands, even when complete restoration proves impossible. The shadowy figure who stalked Cleveland's vulnerable with surgical precision has never been conclusively identified. The medical knowledge that defined these killings, knowledge meant to heal rather than harm, remains the case's central paradox. Somewhere in America's medical history, a healer became a killer, leaving a legacy of precision violence that continues to disturb and fascinate nearly a century later. As modern forensic techniques continue to evolve, the preserved evidence from these murders awaits new technologies that might finally provide definitive answers. Until then, the Cleveland torso murderer remains what Detective Marilow called a physician of death, someone whose medical oath to preserve life was betrayed through anatomical expertise turned toward destruction. The mystery endures not just because the killer evaded identification, but because they embodied a fundamental human fear that those entrusted with specialized knowledge might use it not to better humanity, but to perfect murder itself.